Conroy. I'm an assistant professor of French, and I'm the coordinator for Digital Humanities Methods. For those of you who aren't aware, we're sponsored by the Department of Research and Innovation, and we're co-sponsored by the Marcus Moore Center for the Humanities, of course with the help of Sarah Potter, the director. Our goal for this year is really just to start a conversation about digital humanities on campus. And you know, some of you might even be skeptical, what is digital humanities? Because I think it's a term that does get overused. But we want to take it in the broadest possible sense. So really, any time that someone is working in humanities and asking humanistic questions and using computers, that could potentially be digital humanities. So we'd like to open this conversation with a conversation about teaching and how we can use digital archives in the classroom. Of course, you know, what is an archive? What is a digital artifact? So there's a lot of open questions that we might all define in different ways. So that's why we really want to design these as both workshops and as a conversation. So as workshops, you know, if you have a laptop, feel free to use it. You can maybe, you know, look at the websites that people are talking about. If people mention software and it sounds like, wow, this is really something that could be useful for me, you know, feel free to, you know, install it, click around, try and use it. Because at least I found a lot of times when you go to these digital humanities workshops, you hear a list of 50 technologies. You know, you want to install 15 of them, you get home, you can't even remember what it is. So feel free to use technology as you hear about it, and also to ask questions. So to say, for example, you know, you mentioned mapping. What software would you use for that? Or you said create a website. You know, what's some software I could use for that? At the same time, I think feel free to jump in and say, you know, I've actually done this, and I use a software package that's worked really well for me. So we want this to be very much an open conversation. We will have presentations, and so today we have two presentations. One speaker, Christine Eisel from history, and then Will Thompson from world languages and literatures. But we see this very much as a conversation. So we have presentations, and then we have some time for Q&A. And then after the two presentations, we'll have lots of time to just discuss this question of, you know, what is an archive? What is a teaching archive? What kinds of resources would you like to see on campus, both for creating archives and for and using them to teach? So today, our first speaker is Christine Eisel. She's an instructor of history. She got her PhD from Bowling Green State University in 2012. Her research is on colonial America. She works on women and gender, colonial law and policy, and folkways in colonial America. Her current work, is this your current work? Examines women's gossip in two of Virginia. I found it on the web. Two of Virginia's earliest colonies. Using county court records that date back to the 1630s, she pieces together an investigation into women's speech and the corresponding punishment, revealing not just women's role in early Virginian society, but also the interaction between women and formal institutions. So she's going to talk today about how to create an archive for teaching.
Thanks for having me talk to you today. I'm going to talk to you about a project that I collaborated with Bridget Bilodeau in our special collections here at McWhorter Library. And she and I actually created this presentation together. We presented it at a conference called Women's History of the Digital World a couple of years ago. I tragically emailed her very, very late about this workshop today. So I was kind of hoping she would be here, but I just want to make it really clear this is very collaborative between the two of us, both the project and the presentation that I'm going to show you. So the presentation that I wanted to show you today really focuses on the experiences in a collaborative design of a project that we created at first for an online women's history course. So I'm going to focus on that aspect of it, and then I'll talk a little bit about what happened after in other courses. I had envisioned a project for students in this course that would not only engage them in primary and secondary source research and analysis, but would memorialize their work in a way that traditional research papers do not. So the students worked in teams, and for the online course, there were 21 students in the class. Later, when we did it on campus for the same course, there were 35 students. We envisioned that they would be constructing an exhibit featuring Tennessee women's lives. Building on archival materials curated from the University of Memphis Special Library Special Collections, student teams biographized and contextualized women's lives throughout the 19th and 20th century Tennessee history, reflecting social, economic, political trends in ways that demonstrated women's participation in creating, maintaining, and challenging cultural norms. So when I started thinking about developing this course, Women American History, for our online students in particular, and our online courses, as you know, are asynchronous, I played with some ideas on projects on which students would work on over the semester. So I really wanted a project that would be meaningful to students and one in which they could use local archival source material. For an online course, though, that presented some challenges. It was a little bit tricky because they would need to be able to access the course material. And although the majority of the students in this class were not true distance learners, most of them were on campus, I couldn't count on the fact that they were on campus or force them to be on campus since it was an online class. So we had to think about a way to be able to create this project and make material available to them so they could work with it. So I thought about some kind of digital project, and I had no idea how to do this. This was a brilliant idea, and I had zero idea of how to carry this out. And I had mentioned it actually to a friend of mine who worked at the library at the time, and she put me in touch with Bridget and said, I think this is somebody that can actually help you, because she at least knew what the archival material was. It turns out she actually knows a lot about digital humanities as well. So we started talking about kind of what kind of project that we wanted to do, and I'm playing both parts here. So me, now Bridget. Okay, so Bridget explained to me, I explained to her kind of what I wanted to do, and I had forwarded to her an article that I had found. I was researching ideas from the American Historian on a digital project that actually used GIS. And I was just trying to kind of get ideas on, like, what could you do in a classroom over a semester, that would work. I knew nothing about GIS, but Bridget made very clear to me that this was way too complicated of a thing to do with students, over like one semester and still have to do content too, right? Sort of outside of the methods class. So we were thinking about other things, and she thought that OMECA would actually be something that would be useful, something that would be manageable and that we could make public, and the students would be able to explore women's history in Tennessee through creating this project. She had previous experience with OMECA as a way to create collections that students could then populate with basic metadata that would result in a class site that would be cross-promoted through both the history department and the library. And the type of project had actually never been attempted before by anybody at the library, right? So in this kind of collaboration. So it was a bit of an experiment for both of us to see how this was going to work. So we wanted to create and design basically a website that would exhibit archival material and would also include historical methods, right? So students showing how they researched, what they researched, creating narratives along with the archival material. So Bridget first started working on curating material. This is the OMECA. So there's two. If you go to OMECA, there's two different OMECA URLs. There's an omeka.org. That is not what you want. You want to go to omeka.net, all right, because that's how you can actually create an account. So OMECA has a few different options of platforms to choose from, and there is a free platform. It had enough memory in it for us to be able, enough space in it for us to be able to do this project. We had way more space than we actually needed, and we actually were able to. I'll show you in a bit, but it actually used two tabs in that one OMECA project for 2 different years. So we did a project in 2015 and a project in 2016. So with the free OMECA, you can do quite a bit with it as far as space. You're limited in design, basically. So space is there, design is limited. So we started digging up archival material from special collections. And again, this is where Bridget was really necessary. So collaboration is key. There are people at the library that know this stuff, so I think it's really important to utilize them. She kind of knew, I didn't want to pick sort of topics for students and then not be able to find material for it. So it was really important to work with her so that we could come up with themes that she at least had an idea that there was something in there that we'd be able to find, right, on women. So together, and things were kind of popping to her in her head immediately, kind of what kinds of things that she could pull for us as well. None of this stuff was cataloged. It was just all boxes that we dug through. So we ended up choosing 7 topics: activism, civic life, domesticity, education, entertainment, media, and politics. The University Libraries Department of Preservation Special Collections has long been involved with digitizing material from its archives for use outside of the archives. They had done some projects where they did like scan-on-demand projects. Those were generally sort of one-off requests that they did from different patrons. And then they began to sort of think about a planned approach to digitizing materials. Those materials that is not anything we ended up using. So we actually ended up digitizing our own materials for it. They also had developed some finding aids, and these were useful, right? And again, this is something where a librarian's going to really come in handy with this kind of project because she was familiar with the finding aids, and she could make those available to students. So we had to really work in concert together for that. So Bridget and I had met on a number of occasions in the fall. I taught this course in the spring semester, so we began meeting in the fall to talk about criteria for inclusion for materials to be used for the project. Again, based on what she knew was held in those archives, we had picked those 7 topics once we kind of knew what the class size was going to be approximately. And we wanted to keep, students worked in groups, and we wanted to be able to keep them kind of manageable. We also needed items that were going to be, easy to digitize, so nothing that was oversized or really lengthy. Kind of rule those things out, things in poor condition. We also needed to have enough material, curate enough material that students could then kind of pick and choose. We didn't want to, control their research, right? We wanted to give them as much latitude as we could. So picking just a variety of things and just, digitizing everything we could and creating curated sort of drop boxes for them, let them be able to go through that and kind of pick and choose what they wanted. Bridget again knew some of the particular items and collections that were going to be useful to us. In particular, there was the Catherine Lawless Compton papers, the Merriweather family papers, which have been used quite a bit by the library and by others. So we did tap into those, and finding aids were actually already available for those, so that actually helped as well. We also digitized just other sort of random material from the collections, particularly portions from the department's newspaper morgue, in order to provide some context for students. In some instances, students were directed to the Internet Archive, where the library already housed some materials that were owned by the university and some oral histories that were located there. So some of the topics were pretty easy to connect to primary sources, and we could pull and digitize those. Some were more difficult. Special Collections has over 600 manuscript collections and tens of thousands of photographs and paper manuscript items. So again, it was sort of a lot of material to kind of whittle down into something that was manageable, plus 60,000 books housed in the department as well. So in the end, approximately 9 collections were selected to pull from, and we created over 500 scans for the project. Manuscript materials, books, images that made up the bulk of the material that we used. And from these, students ultimately chose items to create 79 records. So out of the 500, they chose 79, and each group used very low levels of items that were given to them. So it was really within their drop boxes. It was their choice on what they wanted to use. Okay, so students access project directions via our online learning platform, D2L, eCourseWare D2L. They had instructions set up in there just for the project, kind of step-by-step instructions on what they were supposed to do. I broke the project down into manageable sections and getting started, which gave them a brief explanation of the project and directed them to give me their topic preferences. We had already developed those topics, so they just had to choose. And then once I had assigned them topics, they created a course discussion. I created course discussion forums for them, and we embedded Bridget into the class. So she was an embedded librarian in the class, so that she could go in and if they had a question about the library or finding aid or archival material, something like that, that was something that if I couldn't answer the question, she's already in the class, she can answer that question. Okay, so the discussion boards varied. We had arranged by, this is where they picked out topics and we were assigning the topics, and then we broke those out into groups. And so each group could access their topic, and then they also had a discussion forum, just sort of a general discussion forum and like an Ask the Librarian discussion forum. So they were able to communicate that way. The next step was on secondary resources, and we directed students to, in each group to collaborate and work on an annotated bibliography. I informally gave each group some parameters on what we had already found in the collections, especially concerning date ranges, but I avoided directing them too much, and because I didn't want to rein them in on their on how they were thinking about these sources and their projects. So then they created annotated bibliographies. They used Dropbox, and we created group Dropboxes for those too, because they were still working together on that using eCourseWare. And then we got to the primary sources. So they went through, we had put all of the archival material in the open source Dropbox, so not outside of eCourseWare, so they could access it. We also wrangled an intern from history who was actually working on something else. I'm like, please come help us. And he did a lot of scanning, digitizing, but he needed to access those Dropboxes, and so it was just easier to do it this way, and it held more material rather than having to embed him in the class as well, and for privacy issues with the grad students. So we just used open access software for that. So each Dropbox then was populated with different kinds of archival material. We showed, they were zip files, we showed the students how to access that. And then they could go through the materials that were scanned and uploaded and start picking out the things that they wanted to use. They were asked to consider which of the scanned items were most relevant to the secondary sources that they had chosen, those that were the most visually interesting, reminding them that this was going to be an exhibit that was online, so we wanted some visual interest there. And those that they could build a story around, write a narrative around. So the students submitted their ideas, gave me a list of and a description of each resource that they found. And then they do this all through individually and then peer reviewed each other to kind of keep each other honest. So, and then in step 4, they started writing narratives that would introduce their group collection to create document descriptions and then the metadata. So they had some learning aids on on how to create basic metadata and what would need to be included on the MOCH site. And again, these are learning aids that were developed by the library, so we were able to tap into those and post those on our eCourseWare site, so students had access to those and could start working on their metadata as they were going through sources, right? So they wouldn't have to keep going back and forth for things. And I will say, so writing the narratives and in particular the metadata was probably the most challenging piece of this, especially working online. It was when we repeated the project in the classroom a year later, and it was a little bit easier working with that because Bridget and I could kind of double team them. And I also had an intern that year as well that just worked on this project specifically. And and we were able to, and we taught her Omeka, and so we were able to kind of double team, triple team the students and experience those. But so this was probably the trickiest part. But Bridget had created these handouts, and using actual examples from the collections that we were using, so they could kind of go through and follow kind of step by step to be able to add their materials to Omeka. So we made a mock site for them so that they could go in and look at Omeka and kind of play around with it a little bit. Okay, so this is the mock site, and it gave just students, some sort of basics on what the site, what Omeka looked like, some information on creating records for their primary sources, what sample images would look like once they're on Omeka. I also told them to go around. There's, I think, maybe somewhere between 5 and 7 themes, so layouts that come with the free Omeka format, and so I asked them to pick a theme so they could look. And there's a collection of Omeka projects that are available, and they could also kind of go through those and see what did they want their exhibit to look like. So they have a lot of control over what the final product ended up looking like. Okay, so we did a little bit of work in the mock-up site. They kind of were starting to write up their metadata after after they wrote their narratives and had selected their material. And then they had these learning aids, and again, we had links to those in our eCourseware course page so that they could access those, and there was just kind of step-by-step information on how to add an item, how to add a collection, how to edit the collection, right? So we set up a lot of this ahead of time for them, like the home page. We set up for them the basic structure of it once they told me what they wanted it to look like. We set up for them, and then we gave them access through a universal password that they could access it and make changes to it, make changes to their particular group's work. We can make these links available. So this is the finished project from 2015. This is the home page. And there's links to this also on my faculty page, so if you ever go back to it. So we were able to create 2 tabs, one for the 2015 project and one for the 2016 project, because we had enough. The files we used were compressed, so we were able to save space that way. So we then were able to add more to it. We still have plenty of space left. So the 2015 site ended up looking like this. This is actually a document that students found. And we have a landing page that sort of explains the project and who is involved, and then looking here going into collections. So each of the groups is listed on the side, and then their archival material. So the students had to pick like which of the things that they chose, of the archival material pieces that they chose, which did they want highlighted, right, in this section. So they were able to make that choice, able to choose that when they added. So I go to education because that was go back. Okay. So the education project was a particularly good narrative. So they wrote essays, right? They were actually very confused by the narrative, by the way, but they wrote essays, and they still used, historical methods, and those essays then were the introduction to their archive. So this is their essay on education. I mean, and this essay was actually pretty well done. They still had to use, Chicago Manual to cite their sources, and have a bibliography, and then this is where they're learning their metadata, right? Who created this project, who published it, who contributed to it, and then all of their material is listed down below. So, and for each one, they had to do the complete metadata. So they have the title, the subject, description. They each, so they had to write a description for each of the pieces that they chose. And the rest of the metadata, creator source, etc. We gave them the rights information, so they have that. So that's the project. When we did it in the classroom, we did not curate the material for them. We took the class over to special collections. I think we had maybe 4 or 5 outings over to special collections after the students were put in groups. And they looked at the first exhibit, and they discussed what they wanted to improve on it, right? So was there a topic that they thought they could improve on or add to? Were there topics that they wanted to explore that were missing, right? And so then, so we went over to special collections then, we dragged out boxes and they went through them. I also learned that students do not know how to read cursive writing in that exercise, so didn't know that they weren't taught that anymore, but I think some of the schools are actually going back to that. But anyway, so yeah, so it still had its challenges, right? But it was nice to be on campus where they could actually physically do that. And I will say they really enjoyed that. It was one of the highlights of the project. They really liked just digging through boxes and finding things. So they found some really cool stuff. So that's in the other tab. So that's the project.
Okay, great. So if anyone has any questions specifically for Christine or specifically about her project, questions or comments? How she did this, it's pretty amazing. How long did it initially, did you start working well before the semester?
So
It sounds like a lot to be for a
the first time we did it, we had met the semester before. Like Bridget and I had met the semester before. We had talked about what we were going to do. I looked at Omeka. I had played around with it a little bit. I sort of I had the end goal, right? So, and what, imagining sort of what this would look like. I really was sort of learning Omeka as I was going along. It's fairly intuitive, but when I needed help, I knew where to get help as well. So, and the students, were able to manage it fairly easily as well. We really didn't start because of sort of complicated plans over the winter break. We really didn't start pulling material until the spring semester had already started. So when we sort of created steps for the original project, we're like, do this first. We'll get you the archival material, So work on your secondary sources and look at Omeka and pick out things, right? While we're getting this material together. Of course, we had 5 snow days, and we couldn't get access to the library, and so even Bridget's husband was scanning stuff for us at one point. But it was a lot of work, and I could not have done it by myself, right? So collaborating with them was key. Having an intern was important, so an intern or a grad student, somebody that can really help. I actually did another project with my early North America class, and I had 2 grad students in there, so we taught them Omeka, and then they could do the editing. So taking a little bit off me. So, there's ways to do it, but up front, it's a lot of work depending on where you're getting your material from. And, teaching the students Omeka and the metadata, and if you kind of needed a step-by-step plan, but Bridget had a lot of that stuff.
So I'm not otherwise familiar with Omeka, and I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about how much is it moving toward just these sort of individual projects, and how much is it, I know it's trying to house bigger collections of things for access to various groups of people, but is it trying to build something bigger, or is it really isolated projects?
Yeah, it's, I haven't really gone back to it in probably over a year, but so the different sites, right, depending on whether you're using a free site or a pay site, right? There's sort of an institutional site, right, which is more expensive. And there's a couple in the middle range, and then the free site. And yeah, so they are doing sort of bigger projects outside of just education as well. So actually was at this Women's History in the Digital World, and our panel chair was one of the designers of Omeka. Coincidentally, it just happened that way. And so she's probably a really good resource. Her name's Sharon Leon. But yeah, so it was originally, I think, created within the academic world, but it has bigger applications. So a lot of libraries are using it, museums, and things like that. So it's sort of creating these digital archives.
But so you wouldn't necessarily know that it was Omeka that they were using? As opposed to just they have something.
No, if you go to my site, I don't think it necessarily says Omeka on there. Yeah.
So I have a question about the online class component of it. I think it's so amazing that you were able to do a project of this scale with an online student population. And so I'm assuming most of the students were locals in Memphis, correct?
The majority were.
Okay.
And when I put groups together, I made sure that at least one person in every group was A, in Memphis, and B, willing to come to campus if we needed them to.
Oh, okay, because I was going to ask how you dealt with students that were maybe either far-flung or not
Yeah.
local to the area. And I mean, because this has the potential for collaboration across, wherever. But with such a locally grounded project, how do you manage that? So.
So that was, we were lucky that we just had enough students in the class that were local, that we were able to assign one to every group. And again, I asked them first, who in the class would be willing to come to campus and go to the library or come to my office if we need you to? And we had enough people that were willing to do that we could assign one person to every group. I lost my train of thought when I answered a different question. But yeah, so in for the online piece of it, it was really sort of what could they do, right? And how could we tap into special collections and highlight those, right? And collaborate with the library to highlight those and still make it accessible, right? So it's a lot of work on the front end to do that. I did another project with students, as I mentioned, in early North America, and they found digitized material that was already published on the web. So that's how they did, because we don't have enough on 17th and 18th century America in our archives for them to be able to do that. So there's a couple different approaches you can do.
And that's kind of a dumb question, but how did they have time to do this and do other work in the class? You know what I mean? Like how did you structure this? It's not the digital humanities part, but if you're really thinking about doing this, how did you get them to do it?
So in the class, when I taught it in the classroom, on Fridays was project day.
I see.
Yeah, so when I taught, I asked for it to be Monday. It was the only time I've asked to be on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule. I asked to be on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We also had the computer lab in Mitchell Hall at the time, which we don't anymore. That was really useful because on Fridays we went up to the computer lab and they were able to work on the computers there, or we went over to special collections. So a lot of it was they were able to do in the classroom.
Yeah.
And some of the writing they had to do out of it, but then they could come back together and do some editing. And online, I just made a schedule for them, and similar to what that Monday, Friday schedule would have looked like. So they were still doing, content, still having, to do their discussions and write essays, but sort of incorporating the project right into those bigger discussions too. So. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Okay, so our next speaker is Will Thompson, and he's the chair of World Languages and Literatures, and he's associate professor of French. His research is in contemporary French and Francophone literature and French heritage in Missouri and Illinois. Today he's going to talk about creating a community-based archive, specifically presenting an archive online. And so his experience with the website on the history and cultural heritage of the old mines area of Missouri. So this is one of the last communities, French-speaking communities in the area, and it's also one of the oldest communities in what's now Missouri. And I think it's a really interesting model for us to think about how we can work with communities in the surrounding area to create archives that would be meaningful for them.
I don't have a PowerPoint, but just so you don't drift off, I'll show you some pretty pictures. Actually, that's a really good one. This is actually the church called St. Joachim Catholic Church in Old Mines, Missouri. Has anybody ever heard of Old Mines before? Good, I have a captive audience. My friends would say, oh God, here he goes again. So this project and my fascination with French heritage communities in was now Missouri and Illinois is totally outside the bounds of my original research orientation. As Melanie mentioned briefly, my PhD was on women in the prose fiction of Jean Genet, the 20th century French writer. And I came to the University of Memphis to teach language and teach literature classes. And I really had no idea that many years down the line I would find a completely new area for research orientation that would sort of consume my life. There's a very long trajectory as to how I went from focusing on literature to focusing on this topic, but that's about an hour-long rant of my personal history, so I'll dispense with that. But as Melanie said, I investigate the history and I approach my topic from the cultural studies point of view, which is a nice way of saying I can do all sorts of stuff even though I have no training in history, I have no training in anthropology, I have no training in archaeology, I have no training in sociology, and all of those are somehow implicated in the topics that I cover when looking at this community. So it actually did originate in my teaching, although I'm not, and I do talk about the French presidents in the United States when I'm teaching my classes, in particular the class I usually teach in the fall, which is French Civilization, and the class I'm teaching right now, which is Contemporary France in the Francophone World. But as I've engaged in this research, I have pursued sort of your traditional path of conference presentations, articles. I have a book project that's underway right now. But as I was engaging this in this topic and traveling up to Missouri and Illinois, visiting these sites and meeting people who had an interest in this for various reasons, I started thinking what kind of project would have the greatest impact. And the reason I posed this question to myself was that I found I was dealing with a completely different audience compared to the audience that would read or be interested in the authors that I had studied and written articles about from a literary perspective. And in fact, this audience is very diverse. There are obviously people in French studies, French teachers, French professors, okay, through post-secondary graduate, but also other fields, history, of course, anthropology, but also, especially in the community, the region of southeast Missouri and southwestern Illinois in particular, amateur historians, people who wouldn't call themselves historians, yet they are perhaps the local experts on the topic. Local residents who may or may not trace their origins back to the original French settlers. The descendants of the original inhabitants who no longer live in the area but still have a connection to the community. And some of them are in the St. Louis area, which is St. Louis being just an hour north of the Old Mines community. But also there are people in California and all over the place who get in touch with me saying, my family came from Old Mines, and my parents, my grandfather came from Old Mines, and they're very interested in this. And it's a tremendously understudied topic for various reasons. I think the French presence in the American Midwest is largely neglected. Sorry, history people, but it's largely neglected in history, the field of history. And this particular community, there's one reason I always go back to, is that it was never an incorporated community. So it was kind of literally off the map, and therefore it just never got much attention. And that it was also a very poor community. and a French-speaking community, so largely neglected because they were just these poor, illiterate French people who spoke this weird French, and why would we want to pay attention to them? But I've also been in touch with archivists, librarians, state park employees, National Park Service people, haven't been in touch with them recently, archaeologists, just a very wide variety of people. So I find myself, as I'm doing this research and thinking, gee, this is a topic people don't know much about, but the public who wants to know about it is so vast and different. What am I going to do? And what is going to interest people? What's going to be of use to people for personal reasons, from a pedagogical standpoint, because there's a real interest in French studies in the U.S. now of incorporating the French heritage in the United States into the curriculum. It's been there all along, but everybody sort of knows, yeah, Louisiana, Quebec, but it's a much more complicated topic than that. So what could I look at? What could I include? What's my project going to be? And so I was very fortunate a few years ago to have a faculty research grant from the university that did two things. It allowed me to obtain a large number of materials that were otherwise difficult to get, also to create this website and to pay for the domain name and the hosting for several years, and also it funded a lot of travel. I traveled up to old mines several times, largely to meet with people, one person in particular, although others who have contributed, to scan images, read copies of pamphlets, just amazing variety of printed materials that only exist in the hands of the local population, programs from the church the bicentennial celebration of the church in 1970s, just things that you just can't find anywhere. I get a lot of notices from interlibrary loan saying this book cannot be found at a library or cannot be delivered to the University of Memphis. It's that kind of topic. So here I am, completely new area, completely out of my area of expertise, and I thought, well, let's go ahead and see what happens. So I thought I'm going to create a website, and as you can see at the top, it's got an accompanying. I created a Facebook page shortly after that, and eventually also created a biannual electronic newsletter that gets sent out by email. And I thought if 10 people like this, I'll be happy. That's probably more people than would read one of my articles on a French author, so honesty. So let's see what happens. As you can see in the menu on the left, this, if you're interested in what kind of platform I'm using, this is a Weebly, which, if you aren't familiar, it's just it's website designed for dummies, so it's perfect for me, and it's served me very well. So you can see I'm including a variety of information. Under the history is basically a timeline of the community. And just to give you a very brief introduction, in 1700, a French priest writes, as he's in the Jesuit relations, how there's lead in Missouri. Now, lead was very important because they used it for a variety of purposes, including making shot. The French, although they really wanted silver and gold because that's what the Spanish found, and they only found lead. But lead was pretty good to have. So this mining community was a lead mining community up until about the middle of the 19th century, or the time of up to about the time of the Civil War, and then it became a barite mining community. Barite, which they call tiff, which is originally a French word, is used in, it's an agent in the petroleum industry, help making paint, has a variety of uses. So they had basically exhausted the lead, but they found something that was also valuable called barite, which was mixed in with the lead, and so it became a TIF mining community. Up until, I think the last TIF mining was perhaps maybe a couple of decades after World War II. I think by the 70s it was just about done. Language link I won't show you because there's nothing there right now. It's under construction. But this was a community that spoke French. There are still people in the community who know French vocabulary, but just in the last few years, the last French speakers, those who could communicate in French and with any kind of proficiency, they've all died off, in spite of rumors to the contrary. A lot of what I've included are the images, such as you see here. I'll show you. Yeah, just to show you where it is. That's a nice family picture there. So, yeah, old mine. So that highway going out the middle of the top of the map, that goes to St. Louis. So we're an hour south of St. Louis, about 40 minutes west of the Mississippi River. If you've ever been to St. Genevieve on the Mississippi River, that's very closely related historically to old mines. And so I've got maps, images like that, documents. I have anything that's online, articles, books, and so on. I've posted links to that. The bibliography is about a 30-page document of anything related to the history of the community. I'm reading books about the history of lead mining in the United States. It's not really interesting, but it's directly related to what I'm doing. Events, I do keep up on what's going on now, what are some of the activities related to the French presence, not only old mines, but the region in general, because there is such a connection to old mines, St. Genevieve, not as much St. Louis, which is mainly, the French presence is minimal at best now, but there's Fort de Chartres and Kaskaskia in Illinois. So within this one region, there are a lot of historic sites. St. Genevieve has just been made a national park. They're not quite sure what that means. It's been shut down, nothing's really happening with that. But you can see there's a lot going on. So there's definitely either through local population that may not have French heritage, but they're interested in the history of the area, and the local population that does trace its roots back to the original French settlers who started living in the area, mining TIF and mining lead and then TIF in the 18th century. In a few years, let's see, next year actually is the bicentennial of the establishment of the parish of St. Joachim in Old Mines. And the church is still there and is still very much the center of the community. If I go back to the images, the church has a cemetery which is very much admired in the world of people who are interested in old cemeteries in the United States, because a lot of the grave markers are iron crosses, because they were a poor community, could not afford tombstones, and so they had iron markers, most of which now, some of them you can very faintly see there was writing on them, most of them they're old, so you can't really tell. And then, but they're also the modern cemetery, which is, I have this morbid fascination with cemetery. It's weird. I learned one. And if you go to the new cemetery at St. Joachim, here we go. You can really see the proliferation of French names like Auchan, Batreau, Piquet, Beaune, which was originally B-E-A-U-L-N-E, Bourbon, Bourbon, Boursa, Boyer, Coleman, was actually, he was a German, he was Coleman, but he married a French woman as soon as he got to St. Genevieve and then became French speaking. Cordaway, which was Courtois. So there's some people, there are 3 different spellings of one name, and so on and so forth. And let me tell you, when you post an image on Facebook of any of this stuff, people are sharing it all over the place. As I said, I thought I'd be happy with 15, 20 people liking or visiting the page or liking anything. And when I created the Facebook page, at a time when Facebook was even more popular than it is now, I just started seeing the numbers going and things getting shared, and now I checked this morning, I'm at 1,020 likes. I think that's a lot for a subject that I was basically ignorant of a decade ago. I just really had no idea how much people felt a connection to this topic. As I said, it is historians. I have a historian who lives, he's a retired historian, university professor who lives in the town where the original man who had a grant to mine in old mines, he's from that town, and he sent me a photograph of Philippe Francois Renaud's home, which still stands in this little town in the Ardennes Mountains in northeastern France. So it's getting around the world. The website this month has had 900 page views, and I have 125 people who want to get my newsletter twice a year. And the newsletter is sort of a mishmash of stuff. You can actually get the old issues on the website. Some of it is genealogical, some of it's photographs of events, some of it is little articles that people send to me. It's just sort of to keep interest in the project going. But the level of interest has really blown me away. I think I'll see a sign that I think is kind of interesting. There's a little tiny former community, it's in floodplain, so it doesn't exist anymore, called Belgique, which is the French for Belgium, just outside of Perryville, Missouri. If you ever go up I-55 to St. Louis, it's just off I-55. And I thought, well, this is kind of neat. And there's no town anymore. There's nothing left because they were told if it floods, you aren't going to get any money you aren't going to get any federal aid, so everybody left. It's still great farmland, you just can't live there. But there's an old cemetery there that's still there for whatever reason. They did not relocate the cemetery, and it was a bunch of Flemish and French-speaking Belgians who, in the late 1800s, so it's not directly connected to my community, but because of the linguistic aspect, I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting, I'll post it. Holy cow, people saying, I know Belgique, my parents came from Belgique, and they're sharing it with all their friends, and there are people coming back to me and saying, where did you get this photograph? Where's the sign? I want to see it. And I'm like, who knew? Who knew? So it's been really exhilarating for me to work on this project, and I talk to it about my students. I say, this is a French heritage that's just 3 hours from Memphis. Old Mines is about 4 hours. You can get to St. Genevieve in about just over 3 hours. And the local population there is very much aware of this. But it's a very understudied topic. I am actually on the board of a group called the Center for French Colonial Studies, which studies the entire, basically anything north of Louisiana and south of the Great Lakes. And we're small, but we're active. But it's interesting that a lot of what I want to do is just help people see this history, not in the form of a scholarly article, or got a couple out, or presentations at conferences, because usually I'm preaching to the choir, talking to people who already know about it, but putting information out there and realizing that there's a tremendous interest that I never could have expected. So it's ongoing too. So I update the website whenever I need to update it. Actually, I was updating the link today because then the links die, and you have to find out what happened. Did they die, or did they move, or what happened to them? There are videos and recordings. There's a great musician named Denny Stromat who learned in old mines from the last generation of people who knew the language. He learned the folk songs, and you can find his videos. He was actually invited by the Library of Congress to perform in Washington at a folklore festival. And so there is, it's still active. There's still a great appreciation, even though the linguists will say it's not interesting anymore because the language has died out. But if you go up there, my good buddy that I've gotten to know very well, who lives there, who provided me with most of the images to scan, we'll go out to the local bar, because that's what everybody does. And I always take my baseball cap with me when I drive up there, because I want to fit in. And he'll say, oh, that's my distant cousin. He'll have him come over and he says, so, you know any French? Oh, no, I don't know any French. He said, what about maudit? French, maudit is damn. And they're like, oh, that's a bad word. I don't know any French. So there's this passive knowledge that's still there, which I find fascinating. But I'm not a social linguist, so that's a huge project. I'd really love to grab somebody and say, hey, wouldn't you like to work on this with me? Because nobody's done any work on the language in a long, long time. So that's the nature of my project, and product is there, oldminds.org. And happy to take any questions.
And does anyone have questions specifically for Will Thompson? Questions specifically for Will Thompson?
So I've been looking at the site. It's really cool.
Oh, good, thanks. As I said, I've done most of it myself in spite of my, I'm not bad at technology, but Weebly is, I'll go with Weebly any time. But yeah, it's a lot of fun to work on, but it is, I spend a lot of time on making sure the history's right and the timeline's right. And I do have friends, especially who are descendants of the original inhabitants, who share information. They correct me on things from time to time. But it's the images that gets the most hits, because I haven't seen it. And the aspect of the images that gets the most interest is the people. To the best of my knowledge, everybody's dead who's in these photographs, because I don't want anybody coming to me saying, hey. So I've made sure that you don't see it right here, but every photograph is acknowledged as to its source, which is largely one person, although I've gotten them from other people. But I'll post a photograph and say, hey, if anybody doesn't want this photograph to be here for some reason, just let me know. I've never had, in fact, people say, oh, I've got that photograph too. And sometimes they'll say, that's so-and-so that I didn't know was in the picture. So these are many people from Old Mines, family group pictures, and I think if I actually go back, if you bear with me, to the mining is really interesting. And the fascinating thing is this guy on the right, the guy who wore white, which nobody in Old Mines would have done at that time. This was taken in the 30s. This is Joseph-Médard Carrière, who was from Quebec, but he was a professor at Northwestern, and he actually conducted the first study of the French language in Old Mines in the 1930s. And his wax cylinders, where he recorded the people telling their folk tales and singing the folk songs, still exist. And have been, I've tracked down exactly what's happening. I know where they are, but I'm not sure. There's a rumor they were digitalized by the Library of Congress, but nobody knows if that's happened or if you can get access to them. It's complicated history there. But that's him with a bunch of TIFF miners. You can see there's a very young man in the front and the center of TIFF miner, and in the 1930s and 40s they got into a lot of trouble because they were taking their kids out of school to work in the TIFF mines. And that was not a thing, and that's a big pile of TIFF in the front. But these are what really gets people going is they'll see a photograph of somebody. And what I tend to do is to lure people in is I'll post one photograph on the Facebook page and say, hey, I've added some more photographs. Go visit the site and like zoom. The great thing with Weebly is you can track your statistics. And whenever I do that, maybe like I quadruple the number of people visiting the page.
Okay, great. So yeah, we have a few minutes left to talk about projects in general. I had one question for both of you, which is you both mentioned a lot of kind of getting started and scanning a bunch of stuff and then realizing the students didn't like it, or kind of back and forth trying to figure out what the components of the archive were. So for somebody who's just starting out, they maybe have a huge stack of photos and they have a huge stack of text, and if they try to digitize everything, it's going to take them 5 years, and what are you even going to put on the website? How would you recommend getting started? How do you decide what your archive is, what your audience is? How would you recommend getting started?
So for my project, because it was specific to a class, and again we chose themes of that cover material that we knew were going to be in the archives, right? So that's why working with an archivist was really essential, and tried to make that manageable. Again, we scanned 500 documents, so there were 3 of us scanning documents. When we had the students do it themselves, they scanned their own documents. They had a scanner available in the library, so they were able to do that. When we curated it for the online class, our philosophy was scan everything, create as a big database of material as we could for the students, so that they had options. Because we wanted really them to feel in control of this project like they would any other project. So now how much of that they looked through, I don't know. They may have taken the first 6 things that popped up in the Dropbox, so, and there's, so much material left that are just sort of hanging in these Dropboxes, and we need to figure out what to do with it. But, because it's not cataloged in the library at all. So maybe we need to partner with the library and, catalog the rest of that. But, yeah, so it was really kind of driven by the course, with course content, and also how could we work this content? How can we work what they were doing in the project into the content for the course as well. So we scanned it.
I found, once I realized what I wanted to do, and I said, I'm going to create a website. I'm going to do a website. I think I basically started with, the menu on the left and just put a caveat on every page, under development, or more will be added, or input, welcome. Some of the things were easy. I had already amassed, being a book and article person and having actually edited a bibliography for many years in French literature, I had a really nice bibliography of materials that I could share. And some of those stuff that was available online, some in libraries, but everything I made sure I checked myself so I knew it existed, I knew it was accessible to people. A lot of them came from the Washington County Library, which is where Mines is. So that was pretty easy. I put that online. And then I say, okay, I can do an events page. I can find out, I know, and I had a links page. Links probably came before events, because by looking at all the different links, I found out, well, what's going on? I can put that there. And then about the same time, I said, well, why don't I do the Facebook page? Because that way I can say, hey, this event's coming up. And if you want to know more, go to the website. The images was definitely oh my God, how am I going to do this? Because when I had the faculty research grant, I spent several trips going up to Old Mines, sitting in the little cubbyhole that he used as an office at my friend's place up there, because he was the one who had all the photographs, and I just spent hours and hours going through his box of photographs, scanning them, and I had my scanner, my laptop, and I can't remember what else I had, but I would be scanning, recording, okay, what image is this? And then on most of them, he had written on the back who was, to the best of his knowledge, who was in the photographs. So I'm typing that information up. And so I'm hundreds of photographs, and then, okay, how am I going to organize this? So I came and said, I'm going to avoid doing individuals at first because people might be more sensitive to that. So I'm going to do like the buildings and the church and the cemetery and the group photographs and the mining. So I kept more to the less personal stuff. But it was really, okay, I've got hundreds of photographs. How am I going to categorize them? How am I going to put them on the website in a way that has some structure, so that, especially if I go in stage 2, is soliciting and adding more and more photographs. Now, every photograph I get is like, here's a picture of 3 people. Do I already have this picture of 3 people? Because sometimes people don't agree who the 3 people are in the photograph. Names are very complicated in that community too, because if you're a Robard, you're also a Polite. So at some point, somebody whose name was Robard took the last name Polite, which was a nickname, but the 2 families are still the same family, so names are complicated. Everybody had a nickname, you know, especially the men. Nobody went by their real first name. They always went by a nickname, and then the last names, spelling the last name right, because the French last names spellings got changed over time, like Bourassa, there were at least 4 different spellings of that. So the photographs are definitely the scary part.
Yeah.
They're the one that's like, okay, I'll work on that later. I'll update my bibliography. That's easy. The photographs are, just because I'll be doing it for the rest of my life, I assume.
And you really do need metadata. You can't say 3 people, 3 people, 3 people.
No, and that's where a lot of,
Yeah.
I've got a lot of photographs where I just don't have the information, and I'd rather not post just, here are 3 people. Yeah. Now, some of it, like the mining picture where, is that still up? Yeah, that was like, we do know who some of those people are, and I bet if I disseminated that again, I would get a lot of responses as, yeah, that's my grandfather, great-great-grandfather, or whatever, so I can probably find out, but I'm comfortable with posting a photograph like that because I'm posting that because it's more about the mining and about Monsieur Carrière on the right there, that long in a very illustrious academic career. He had spent most of his career at the University of Virginia, and he's still, sort of, his materials are still the thing to read. But yeah, there's a lot out there that's false information, or you just don't have the right information, or conflicting information to do. Because I'll post something, it's like, why are you posting that? It's like, that's not related to this, and it's subjective too.
So any other questions about creating an archive? Is anyone working on an archive? Because part of what we're trying to do in the
I was gonna say, we didn't know that Andre has an archive.
No, I don't know. Mine is different. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just here, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. What do you do when you don't have an archive? I'm actually attempting to create one online. So the Henry McNeil Turner Project is what I'm calling it. And real short story, how I got into it is I went to a symposium sponsored by the Colored Conventions, Digital Humanities Project, and Pierre Foreman found out what I was doing. I was actually collecting all of the speeches and writings from Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, a 19th century African Methodist Episcopal bishop. And he does not have an archive. He just doesn't. There is no place that you can go. But the man wrote like every week in a newspaper somewhere. It was always just published all over the place. And I discovered him by, being in grad school, and found out that this guy just published all of this stuff. And I said to myself after I finished, I want to just collect this stuff and put it out traditionally, books, volumes. So I got 6 volumes of Henry McNeil Turner writings, and that's when this came about. Put some of that stuff up on, so what are you talking about? I said, oh, okay, let's do that. And so I've been doing this now for a while. So I'm I'm familiar with Omeka. I need Omeka class. I need like Omeka 101, just, so.
Maybe we should.
Right. So I've been using a blogger to just, so you go to the Henry McNeil Turner Project, you'll see some of the writings, and what I eventually want to do is to not only have the writing, but the newspapers I found them in, scan them in. That was just a whole year of me doing a lot of microfiche and just sitting down, cranking out the old newspapers and printing them out and stuff, and some of the books that I found. There are some pictures online that I've collected as well too. But the big thing is, I think somebody out here in the world somewhere has some old writings of Henry McNeil Turner. If this gets out, then they may want to share that. Then we can have, right, like.
Well, that's what I'm finding.
Right,
People
exactly,
say-
yeah. So.
People send me emails
Exactly.
and say, with photographs, saying, here's a photograph I don't see on your website. I'm happy to share it with
Exactly.
you, and they'll tell me what it is. And one of the reasons I did this is because I'm not sure I can do, well, I do have a book project on old mines, but it's going to be a combination, it's going to be half print, half photographs, mainly because the audience is the locals, and they want pictures. I'm not sure if I can do, I want to do, or I have time to do a scholarly book on old mines, because as I said earlier, I'd have to go back and get training as a sociologist, as an anthropologist, as a genealogist. I just don't have enough time to do all that and do it justice, because it really is, there's so many different things going on. Now, there's some fascinating writings about old mines out there. The one sociological view of it was written by a guy with German background, and so he didn't think the French, he just described them as these dirty French people with this sad story. It's just awful. So there's been some work done on it, but nothing like since the 1980s. And so this community still is so strong. Like you can read in the 30s, like at the end of the 19th century, in the 1930s, people saying, well, they're just going to disappear. They're going to be assimilated. Nobody's going to pay attention to them anymore. And there's still, there's still a lot of interest. So yeah, I think going online is the way to go, because it's, start with baby steps, say, okay, let's put some stuff out there and just get going, and then let's
Somebody
find
might have already done the OCR and stuff, like somebody might have done all that work to put it into a format that would be easier to use online, but until you have that little website that people can come to and say, hi, I'd like to contribute this stuff,
Right.
you can't know.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's what I've been at it for about a year now, and just, and it's a real heavily based, text-based archives, just, transcribing what we see in the newspaper and get that on up. And it's getting some hits, and, right now, but I'm in the middle right now of working with 2 history students, Daylin and Davis and Kim Travers, and they are helping me with the speeches now, the full extant speeches that we have. It was part of a small grant that I received in our department, so I'm going to do that and get that on up. So hopefully, in a couple of weeks, we can at least have a new interface, and at least I know a little bit more of what I'm doing. So.
Okay, well, thank you guys so much for coming over here. I'm glad you guys found the room. So next time we'll be back in our regular room.
Assuming the president doesn't take it again.
Yeah.